The purpose for today's video is going to be a bit different, and I'm hoping to get your help with something. But first, we need to talk about the convictions and impending sentencing of Tamara Lich and Barber. Let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. Long time no see. So today we're going to be taking a break from the normal firearms related conversation on the channel, and instead we're going to be talking about the recent outrage regarding the sentencing of Tamara Lich and Barber. We're still awaiting a final decision from the judge on that front, but as most of you have probably heard by now, the Crown prosecutors have asked for 7 years for Tamara Lich and 8 years for Barber. These were the leaders or the organizers of the Trucker Freedom Convoy, and they were convicted of the crime of mischief earlier this year in April in relation to their actions at the trucker protest. Now, I'll admit, I've not been following this story as closely as I maybe should have been. Last year, I did cover the Emergencies Act ruling from the federal court by Justice Mosley, where he ruled that the use of the Emergencies Act was unconstitutional. But most of the trial itself for Tamara Lich and Barber are relatively unknown to me, so I really can't comment directly on that too much. However, from the sounds of it, especially for Tamara Lich, her crime for mischief essentially boiled down to the fact that she was being inconvenient for downtown Ottawa and refusing to leave. But, isn't that entirely the point of a protest? Protests are supposed to be at least mildly inconvenient. Protests are supposed to be a nuisance. And supposedly, the right to protest is protected under the Charter in Section 2C. But as we all know, the Charter really isn't worth the paper that it's written on. Your rights in Canada are not absolute, which means they effectively don't really exist at all. Now, the good news here, if there is any, is that regardless of whatever sentence Tamara Lich ends up getting, she apparently intends to appeal both the sentence and the conviction. At least according to Ezra Levant at Rebel News.
We're not done. Yeah, the sentencing hearing is today, and in a couple weeks the judge will release her ruling. But Tamara Lich has decided, unless I'm misinformed, to appeal her conviction, even if she gets zero sentence, which is what the law would suggest. So we are not done. And this will go on for months or years, because it's imperative that we not allow the precedent to be set.
Now, for what it's worth, I think she has a reasonable chance at winning on appeal. Your charter right to protest is not absolute, like most of your so-called rights in Canada, but this conviction for mischief would essentially mean that it doesn't exist at all. It's hard to imagine any kind of protest which would be more peaceful than this. Now, the conviction for mischief in this instance isn't related to any sort of violence or property damage, but rather the obstruction, interruption, or interference of the lawful use, enjoyment, or operation of property. And if this disruption or damages to property exceeds $5,000, then you could face up to 10 years in prison as a result. However, the other portion of the mischief crime is that these damages must have occurred willfully. But it wasn't the goal or the objective of the trucker protest to cause financial harm to the businesses of downtown Ottawa. It was merely just a byproduct. Any protest of any kind of scale located in any city anywhere in Canada would be expected to cause disruptions to local businesses. What this would mean is that the crime of mischief would effectively prohibit all protest behavior. And this wouldn't just place limitations on your right to peacefully protest, but rather it would probably eliminate it entirely. Instead of being allowed to peacefully protest, we would instead be required to protest in a manner which is just not inconvenient. And that's directly contrary to the very essence of a protest. For example, instead of the truckers driving to Ottawa and protesting there at the seat of political power, they could have instead driven out into the wilderness and camped out in the middle of some forest on some unoccupied Crown land somewhere to ensure that no one would be inconvenienced by their presence. But what sort of a protest would a 1-month camping trip be if it was happening just out in the middle of nowhere? What sort of impact could that actually expect to have? Now, there are certainly some kinds of protests which would amount to mischief, particularly the type which tends to protest against a specific business, and then where individuals use that protest as an excuse to economically harm said business through vandalism or sabotage or disruptions to operations or whatever else. And in such instances, I think there is definitely a case to be made for mischief. But where this financial harm is merely the byproduct borne by society at large, as a natural result of the mere existence of an otherwise lawful protest, I don't see how that could qualify as mischief without completely eliminating your lawful ability to protest. So unless I'm severely misunderstanding exactly what this conviction for mischief was for, I think she can very easily win an appeal. But of course, the courts are so misguided and broken these days in Canada that we really can't place any trust in them at all anymore. But either way, I do wish Tamara Lich and Chris Barber all the luck in righting these wrongs for the benefit of Canada. But the crime and conviction itself is not really what I want to talk about today. The sentencing is really what has everyone up in arms lately, and the fact that the Crown is seeking no less than 7 years for peacefully protesting, which is absurd. Such severe sentences are usually reserved for fairly heinous crimes, or at least they used to be, because even heinous crimes don't usually result in a 7-year prison sentence anymore. And that's what I would like to talk about today, and also what I need your help with. So what I would like to get out of this video is to create a sort of public record in the comment sections down below, where we could make something of a database of the more severe crimes which have received less severe sentences in recent years in Canada. If some of you know of such a story which happened in Canada, please post it in the comments below. I will be reading all of the comments, and I'll be tagging these relevant stories with the little heart icon to help them stand out if others would also like to read them. If you care to share a story, try to be as specific as possible about the crime and the corresponding sentences. I won't be tagging the comments about some story about some perceived offense or the idea or the notion of the failings of the criminal justice system, and also don't fabricate your story just for attention. I'm not going to be fact-checking any of your stories, and I will only be tagging them at face value. However, there's also no shortage of examples of this in Canada, so there really isn't any reason to be lying or exaggerating any of the details. And lastly, YouTube generally doesn't like it when people share links in the comments. I will still be able to see your story if you do share a link, but YouTube will probably bury it, and everyone else, the rest of the public, probably won't be able to see it. So avoid sharing links if you want people to see your comment. With all of that in mind, I want to start things off by sharing with you one such story. This was a local story which really didn't make any national news or even provincial news, and it also happened about 5 or 6 years ago, just before COVID, if I remember correctly. So unfortunately, I also wasn't able to find any links or local coverage on the actual incident. Anywho, so there was this guy who had just finished serving his time for armed robbery, where he held up a gas station with a knife for the money in the till. He ended up catching a few years for that, and he also had a laundry list of other offenses going back for various other gang-related activities. So he served his time, and then he was released. Now, I don't remember if he was released on parole or statutory release, but he was on a conditional release at the time of this new offense that I'm about to explain to you. And being that he was a violent criminal, he had prohibition orders preventing him from possessing any weapons or firearms as a condition of that release, among a whole host of other conditions. But of course, being that he's a criminal, he doesn't follow any of these rules because that's just how criminals are, and 3 days later he was reincarcerated on a number of new charges. So what happened? Well, as the story goes, Buddy here almost immediately stole a vehicle. He then also acquired a stolen firearm, but it was unclear if he stole it himself or if it was supplied to him by his gang. Not really all that important to the scheme of things, I suppose. Now, for anyone who's curious, it was a typical hunting rifle with a cut-down stock and a sawn-off barrel. But in any case, he was then driving around town in this stolen car with his stolen firearm when he happened across somebody who was supposedly wearing too much of a particular color. So like any good gang member, he jumped out of his stolen car with his stolen and illegally modified rifle, and then proceeded to shoot this other person 7 times, in broad daylight, outside of a strip mall, just a few hundred yards away from one of our high schools. He hopped back into his car, drove away, and the cops caught up to him the next day and arrested him after a brief car chase. Now fortunately, he did not end up getting bail, as is often the case in Canada these days, so he ended up staying in custody pending his trial. Now, I don't remember the full list of charges he originally caught, but you could imagine the huge variety of charges such an incident could get you. He was behind bars for a little over a year, and then just before the trial, after the Crown had gathered enough evidence to have the book thrown at him, they just negotiated a plea deal with him instead. Now, given all that I've told you, including the quantity and the severity of the charges that he was facing, and the fact that he was out on a conditional release for just a couple of days at the time of these events, what do you suppose this plea deal entailed? How long do you suppose the Crown asked for him to be sentenced to after all of this? Well, he got 2 years for stealing the car, To which I say, okay, fair enough. In the scheme of things, like, that doesn't really seem like too ridiculous of a sentence, especially if the car remained undamaged and was returned to its rightful owner at the end of all of this. I could definitely see a version of events where 2 years does make sense for stealing a car. I don't know that this particular guy deserves that kind of leniency, but in the scheme of things, 2 years for stealing a car, that really doesn't seem like a crazy sentence to me. So, fair enough, 2 years. He then got 2 more years for aggravated assault, and that was it. They dropped all other related charges, even the slam dunk ones, like unlawful possession of a prohibited firearm, since he was arrested in possession of a cut-down rifle. It was literally in the car with him when they arrested him. So this whole event and the year of investigation which followed resulted in merely 4 years in prison. 4 total. What the hell? Like, now the astute among you are going, wait, what? Aggravated assault? Well, plot twist. The guy he shot 7 times, against all odds, just so happened to live. Like, even if the rifle was a .22, which seems likely given the circumstances, but I don't remember the specifics of what caliber it was, being it was so long ago, but even if it was a .22, those aren't good odds. 7 shots? Like, those aren't good odds. So Buddy the criminal here beats a murder charge simply out of dumb luck. But how is that not at least attempted murder? Like, it's absolutely insane. And a lot of people don't know this, but the court is actually under no obligation to accept the terms or the sentencing of a plea deal if one is offered by the prosecution. In fact, the courts don't even have to accept a guilty plea from the accused in some circumstances. And now I'm not going to get into the specifics of all that, but the point here is that just because the Crown and the accused got together and agreed to something, that doesn't automatically obligate the court to adhere to the specific terms of the deal. Sentencing is solely the jurisdiction of the court. So just like right now how the Crown is asking today for 7 to 8 years for the convoy organizers, that doesn't obligate the court to give them anywhere near that time. The court is plenty able to give them an absolute discharge if it wants, despite the Crown's wishes. Now likewise in a plea deal, if the deal is too good or too low of a sentence, the courts don't actually have to accept it either. And so to make things worse, the court actually explained some of its rationale in the sentencing for the 2 years it gave out for aggravated assault. Now obviously he got a reduced sentence for the plea deal, and I mean, fair enough. We don't have to like it, but that is, kind of the point of plea deals. But one of the mitigating factors for why he received such a low sentence for his violent actions was the fact that the target of those actions did not, in fact, turn out to be involved in ongoing gang or criminal activities. It was the court's finding that the person who was shot 7 times was just a totally random member of the public. Now, I don't know necessarily how much you should believe that, if it passes the smell test, but that is what they found. And this means that this was just some unsuspecting bystander who was walking down the street. And that finding somehow made this a less serious offense. What? How do you figure that? Like, I get that the court has an interest in stopping repeat behavior for gang-related activities and such, and that such activities should receive harsher sentences to that effect, but that doesn't mean that the safety of random members of the public should be treated as trivial or as less than important. Like, I don't understand how a reasonable person could rationalize the idea that someone is so violent and so unhinged that he's out there shooting members of the public at random, and that fact somehow makes the action more understandable and more acceptable. I honestly don't even know what to say about that. But what this means is that if you take the car theft out as a discrete charge and set that aside, the rest of this becomes pretty insane. When you look at the rest of what happened and you boil it down, what you have is a career criminal without a firearms license hopping out of a car with a stolen firearm, shooting some totally random person 7 times, then evading the police during his arrest where he was then caught red-handed with said firearm, all within a few days of the conditional release from a prison for prior violent offenses. All of that nets you a mere 2 years in prison so far as the courts and the Crown are concerned. But a peaceful protest might get you 7 to 8 apparently. Make it make sense. So if anyone wants to know why people like me say that Canada is broken, that is certainly at least one part of it. And now I want to hear your stories. I want to hear the ridiculous things that you've seen out of Canada's justice system, particularly in situations where the punishments just don't fit the crimes. Your comments don't necessarily have to be as detailed as all of this, but a brief description of what happened and what the charges and sentences were would be good. And hopefully, the comment section in this video can serve as something of a collection of public record and sentiment regarding all of this nonsense going on with the courts and with Canada's justice system in the present day. Now, bonus points if they're stories which are less well known or did not make national news, and additional bonus points if this is a story that involves something like a plea deal or where the Crown is specifically asking for a lesser sentence than what they're asking for Tamara Lich and Chris Barber. I look forward to hearing from you all and to reading your stories. All that being said, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.